Ecology is more than environmental science. Ecology is the study of all interconnected systems on the planet. In the broadest definition, what is personal is universal. Today we will discuss the Millennium Assessment findings and how climate change, the industrialization of food, and the liberal use of synthetic chemicals and plastics are altering the health of humans and the health of our planet. Let's start by looking at the Millennium Assessment Report. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was called for by United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2000. Over 2,000 authors, reviewers worldwide contributed their knowledge, time, and insight to this document. The objective of the Millennium Assessment was to assess the consequences of ecosystem change for human well-being, and then to establish the scientific basis for action needed to enhance the conservation and sustainable use of ecosystems and their contributions to human well-being. In the Millennium Assessment Report, they cited the following: 25% of mammals and 30% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. 2/3 of major marine fisheries are fully exploited, overexploited, or even depleted. 90% of the total weight of the ocean's largest predators has disappeared. And 1 billion people lack access to fresh, clean water. The Millennium Assessment bottom line, and I quote, "At the heart of this assessment is a stark warning. Human activity is putting such strain on the natural functions of Earth that the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted." Well, all of that sounds pretty scary to me, and I almost want to not have to think about it. But as a physician and as a human on the planet, I can no longer ignore the fact that human health is intimately linked to the health of the planet. Let's take a look at some planetary changes that we are seeing right now that are linked to human health and well-being. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a report in 2007. This report stated climate change may directly affect human health through increases in average temperature. Rising average temperatures were predicted to increase the incidence of heat waves and heat extremes. This change in weather will affect humans both directly, the consequences of heat, and indirectly through changes in water, changes in air, and food quality. In the United States, the panel predicts that Chicago will experience 25% more frequent heat waves, and Los Angeles a 4- to 8-fold increase in heat wave days by the end of the century. Heat stress is bad for humans, and we have important instances already that show this. During the summer of 1995, we had the Chicago heat wave, which claimed the lives of over 600 people. But even more remarkably, in August of 2003, 45,000 people died of heat stress in Western Europe. But climate change is not just about heat. The panel also stated, climate change is expected to contribute to some air quality problems as well. Respiratory disorders may be exacerbated as there is an increase in smog events. Higher temperatures lead to worse air quality. The warming up of the climate and worsening of air quality is even further exacerbated by urbanization. The movement of homes to areas where we have to rely on automobiles and the use of the agricultural industry of land has resulted in air quality disruption. Between 1960 and 1990, the number of people working outside their counties increased over 200%. This is one of my areas that I think about as good intentions, but dangerous consequences. We think it's good to move out of the city to get more of nature and green land and trees. But this has resulted in vehicle miles traveled increasing 250% from 1960 to 1997. The average American driver spends 443 hours each year behind the wheel of a car. That's equivalent to around 11 weeks of work. Urban outdoor air pollution is estimated to cause 1.3 million deaths worldwide per year. And those individuals living in middle-income countries are disproportionately experiencing this burden. And air pollution is one of the largest contributors to cardiovascular disease. Studies done in mice show us that even animals on a very high-fat diet do okay in terms of plaque formation, but they get sick and form more plaque, almost double the amount if they get the high-fat diet and air pollution combined, nearly double the amount of plaque as those that inhale filtered air. So why, as a cardiologist, don't we add to our list air pollution as a cause of coronary artery disease? An interesting experiment was done for the Atlanta Olympic Games in 1996. The Atlanta Olympic Games were happening in downtown, and a decision was made to limit automobile use in the area. Automobile use was reduced by 22.5%. But what was so insightful is that someone was measuring hospital admissions for asthma. And what they found was asthma admissions to the Atlanta ER decreased 41%. We know that asthma and heart disease are clearly linked to poor quality of air. Another contributor to poor air quality, as we mentioned, is the agricultural industry. The way we farm is having a serious impact on the environment. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization in 2006 stated that livestock production contributed 18% of world greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than transportation. More recent research suggests that the livestock contribution may be as high as 51% of all greenhouse emissions. Another interesting study in 2006 at the University of Chicago concluded that a person switching from a typical American diet to a vegan diet, that's a diet without animal meat, eggs, or even milk, switching from a typical American diet to a vegan diet with the same number of calories would prevent the emission of 1,485 kilograms of carbon dioxide. The difference obtained by that change in diet exceeds that of an individual switching from a Toyota Camry to the hybrid Toyota Prius. If many of us would just take this step, it would have a profound impact on greenhouse gas emissions. The livestock industry may also be affecting human health in another way. Very frequently, animals are kept on what are called feedlots. Animals are not grazing in the grass. They are kept in confined quarters. And because they're kept in confined quarters, they are routinely given antibiotics to prevent infection. Now, I want to say that again. The antibiotics they get are to prevent infection. It would be like piling a lot of people in the room, and we would all be breathing on each other, and we would take antibiotics to protect each other from getting sick. This is not to treat a sick animal. This is a true misuse of antibiotics. But what's really shocking here is that the agricultural industry uses approximately 71% of the antibiotics produced in the United States. This is important because there is a strong link between antibiotics used in agriculture and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This link has already been established. A report from 2000 looked at antibiotic-resistant salmonella outbreak that occurred in the UK. It traced the outbreak to a dairy farm where a particular antibiotic was used the month before the outbreak. The use of the antibiotic in the dairy resulted in resistant infections in humans. A similar study in 1987 reportedly traced tetracycline-resistant salmonella back to the top dressing of cattle feed. So these antibiotics are put on top of the food. They're added to the water. And in both of these cases, they resulted in a antibiotic-resistant salmonella. Now, antibiotics are a true medical miracle to be used when needed in the right way. We all know this. We tell our patients, take your full course of antibiotics. We don't give antibiotics, for example, for viral infections. We want them when we need them. And what we're starting to see is this liberal use. 71% of all the antibiotics made for the U.S. are going to the agricultural industry. Now, there has been a call to restrict antibiotic use in animal agriculture in the United States. The American Society for Microbiology, the American Public Health Association, and the American Medical Association have called for substantial restrictions on antibiotic use in animal food production. They are calling for an end to all non-therapeutic use of antibiotics in livestock. And more recently, a letter signed by medical professional organizations and sent to Congress in 2011 stated, and I quote, "The evidence is so strong of a link between misuse of antibiotics in food animals and human antibiotic resistance that FDA and Congress should be acting much more boldly and urgently to protect these vital drugs for human illness." Well, we have another problem. And the other problem is this. So we have animals on feedlots. They're not grazing in the grass. They're together. They're being fed antibiotics. And what they're also being fed is corn and other grains which are high in omega-6. These grains raise the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And we have talked a lot about the importance of this ratio and how meat is now recognized, particularly red meat, as being pro-inflammatory. So our food is being greatly impacted. It's affecting us, and the food industry is affecting the planet. But there's one last topic that I feel compelled to discuss. And that is the topic of environmental toxins. And this is a very large area. And I invite you, if this is an area of interest, go to the Environmental Working Group website. Remember, we talked about this when we talked about how do we know which foods we absolutely have to buy organic and which foods we can maybe not buy organic. Well, that website will give lots of information. What cosmetics to purchase, which toothpaste to use, and the list goes on and on. So let's take a look at what the CDC found. In 2009, the Center for Disease Control published the 4th National Report on Human Exposure to Environmental Chemicals. The CDC measured 212 chemicals in people's blood or urine. What was really scary to me as a physician about this report is 75 of these chemicals have never been measured in the U.S. population before. These new chemicals include things like arsenic, environmental phenols, and bisphenol A. Now, there's a large list of toxins. The CDC found 212. And what we frequently hear is, something is okay, we tested it. But what routinely isn't done is things aren't tested in combination. What happens when we get exposed to 3 or 4 of these toxins? No one is looking at that. And that really concerns me, because if we don't look at the synergistic effects, even small doses begin to add up. So what might not seem like a lot could be a big problem. Let's take a look at one of those chemicals that the CDC found, and that's called bisphenol A, also known as BPA. Now, this is an industrial chemical that has been used to make plastics and resins since the 1960s. Where do we find these chemicals? Well, these plastics are often used in containers that store our food, containers that store our beverages, such as water bottles, baby bottles, and cups. Baby toys are even made out of this chemical. We find epoxy resins coating the inside of metal cans. When you open your can and you see that shine, this is the resin. So canned foods, baby formula cans, all contain BPA. The health concern is that the BPA that's lining the cans, that's lining the water bottles, can seep into our food. And this has become a very big concern for all of the holistic physicians that I know. Now, the American Chemistry Council is an association that represents plastic manufacturers. And they say that BPA poses no threat to human health. We don't have to worry about it. But I invite you to look a little further into this, because the Department of Health and Human Services says it has some concern about the possible health effects of BPA. And they're not alone. The Food and Drug Administration agrees with them. I always like to look at what's going on in Canada. I just have the feeling that the Canadians are a little bit ahead of us in this game. They are a little bit quicker to respond to these concerns. And Health Canada's Food Directorate has concluded that the current dietary exposure to BPA through food packaging uses is not expected to pose a health risk to the general population. However, and this is a big however, they go on to make their final recommendation and they say, why don't we limit BPA use, especially in things that our children are exposed to, until there's further research. So, the toxin story is not over. And there are many more toxins that we can look at. Naphthalates, for example, in cosmetics. The list goes on and on. And fortunately, we have groups in this country that are not just taking no problem as an answer. And as I talked about briefly, the Environmental Working Group is one of those groups. And they are actually raising consumers' level of consciousness about this issue. And they're placing tools in the hands of the educated consumer with good backing information that helps us to make clearer decisions. I can't help but feeling in our country that our children are the canary in the coal mine. The most vulnerable people are the elderly and the young. And I don't know about you, but I don't feel right about having BPA in my plastic water bottle. As a matter of fact, I don't want to have it in any bottle, and certainly not in a bottle that we're going to give our children. Well, all of this leads up to some pretty scary stuff. We talked about just one toxin. We talked about climate change. We talked about how temperatures are warming up And this is actually increasing deaths related to heat stress. We talked about how climate change, the rising of temperature, is affecting our air quality. And with that, we see an increase of things like heart disease and asthma. But we got some glimpses today into some things that we can do. Remember Atlanta? They got people to stop driving cars. I went to the Beijing Olympics, and I was there for a week, and they had no cars coming into the city. They really cut the automobiles down. They did that intentionally to try to clean the air. But the week that I was there, I never got to see the sky because of the cloud of smog. But there are good things that we can do, and there are things that we can do right now. I don't want you to leave this lecture and feel hopeless or depressed or just say, forget about it. I want you to think about the next 7 generations, our children and our grandchildren, and the world to come. Because we know that if we take the things we know now, maybe you're going to become a vegan. That would be a great thing. We can immediately start to improve the health of the planet. So let's remember where we started. We said ecology is the interconnectedness of everything. It's a big matrix. Stuff just doesn't disappear. Plastic just doesn't go away. What is personal is universal. Our health is intimately related to the health of the planet, and it's a delicate dance that we have to take together.